Alright, now that the floor is in place, the next step is designing the corridors for our deck. What we use to do that are walls, which you can find under the detail objects. There are about 6 different walls listed there, in addition to the door walls. But the truth is, a lot of the walls aren't really practical to use to create a corridor. The trouble is they have weird shapes, or they just don't fit together that well. There are basically only 3 types of walls that we're actually interested in. The first is wall generic ship 03. This is a good basic wall for a corridor, and it serves as your bread and butter for creating a custom interior. The next type of wall is actually a set of several different walls, all of which are nearly identical. This is wall door 02 through wall door 08. All of these walls have a door in the center of them. The only difference between them is the color of that door and what is written on it. I've listed the differences between the doors here. As you can see, most of the doors are a standard orange color, and there are a few different locations written on them. Now, practically speaking, the text on the doors is so small that you can barely even read it. The doors open automatically as you get close, and the camera in the game is located behind the character, so it's really hard to even see what the text says. Just to give an example of how hard it is, I had trouble reading some of the doors, and I was actually trying to read them in order to figure out the differences between them. Realistically, I would say almost no players are going to read the writing on the door. I guess probably less than 1% at most. That being the case, you really only need to worry about 3 different doors. Door 03, which is blue, door 06, which is yellowish, and door 08, which is orange. The advantage of using door 08 instead of the other orange doors is that it has a generic label, so in the unlikely event someone does read the door's text, it's guaranteed not to be out of place. It's also a lot more convenient to use door 08, because it's on the same axis of rotation as wall generic ship 03, which is what you're going to be using to make your corridors. So, if you need to switch out a wall for a door or vice versa, and that's something you'll probably be doing a lot, using door 08 saves you the hassle of having to rotate it. Personally, I recommend using wall door 08 as your default door. In addition to the door walls, there's another asset that's almost identical, and that's wall turbolift 01 and wall turbolift 02. These are identical to the doors in all ways, except instead of having an open doorway, they open into a turbolift instead. As far as I can tell, both turbolifts are completely identical, so I don't know why there are 2 of them. The last wall is wall door 01. It has a door in the center of it, like the other door walls, but the door is colored gray, and it doesn't open. The main reason you'll use this wall is to create fake doors. The reason you want to do that is to make it seem like there are more rooms or corridors on your map that the player just doesn't have access to at the moment. It's a little trick that can help your map feel larger and more realistic. There's a reason this wall isn't listed with the other door walls, and I'll explain why in just a second. Before you can actually use these walls, there's one more piece of information you need to know, and that's what Y value you need to set them to. If you want the walls to look right, you need to line them up so the light strip at the bottom of each wall matches. Unfortunately, to accomplish that, each type of wall has to be placed at a slightly different Y value relative to the floor. With wall generic ship 03, you want to set the Y value so it's 0.24 beneath the level of the floor. Just take whatever Y value your floor is set to, and subtract 0.24 to get the value for this wall. For your convenience, I have a few common floor heights listed here. For example, if your floor height is set to 1200, then you set the Y value for this type of wall to 1199.76. Or, alternatively, if your floor height is set to 100, you set the Y value to 99.76. Wall door 02 through 08 and the turbolifts all should be set 0.99 higher than the floor. At 1200 elevation, that would mean your wall door should be set to 1200.99. Finally, wall door 01 has to be set 0.91 higher than the floor. And yes, wall door 01 really doesn't quite line up with the other wall doors. Don't ask me why, but it's true. At 1200 elevation, that means you'd have to set any wall door 01s to 1200.91. You might want to write down these numbers because you're going to need them later, and they're hard to remember at first. Okay, so now you know how to place one wall piece, but you might be wondering how they connect together to actually form a corridor. For that, you need another piece of information. On the screen here, you can see another picture of wall generic ship 03. Above it is an arrow, and above that it says plus or minus 9.2. That 9.2 is the key to connecting these wall pieces together. If you take one wall piece and you add 9.2 to either its X or its Z value, depending on its orientation, it'll fit together seamlessly with the other piece. Each section, you just have to keep adding 9.2 and before too long you'll have an entire corridor. Now this might be a little bit confusing, so I'm going to bring up another graphic in order to help explain it. On the screen here, you can see a picture of 3 wall sections connected together. The first is at x equals 0, the second is at x equals 9.2, and the third is at x equals 18.4. I'm using the x-axis in this example, which means this wall will be running left to right across your screen in the Foundry editor. If you were making a wall running from top to bottom on the screen, you would change the z value instead of x, but otherwise it would work exactly the same. You might remember with the platforms, there was a problem with texture fighting. Unfortunately, there's also a problem with these walls. At these 2 circled points, the walls overlap, and there will be texture fighting there. To solve this problem, you need to add 0.001, just like with the platforms. Except this time, instead of adding 0.001 to the y value, you need to add 0.001 to the opposite direction the wall's running. And what that means is if you're running a wall along the x-axis, you would adjust the z value by 0.001. And you would change it for every other wall piece. So the first wall piece would be set to 0, the next one would be set to 0.001, the third would be 0, and so on. If the wall was running from top to bottom, you would change the x value instead. You basically just change the value of the axis that's on the side of the wall. Now this value of 9.2 is derived from wall generic SHPO 3. It's what makes them fit together perfectly. But that doesn't mean you can't use the other wall types with wall generic SHPO 3. The wall doors and the turbolift will also work with 9.2. They'll overlap a little bit, but because you're going to be primarily making your deck out of wall generic SHPO 3, it makes sense to determine the geometry based off of it. To give you an example of placing these wall pieces in action, I'm going to throw together a quick custom interior deck.